With the financial journalist Ian Fraser, who's in our Edinburgh studios. Good evening to you. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening.
I mean, in any other walk of life, you lie, you rig the market to your advantage, you cook the books, you'd be prosecuted straight away. I mean, why do you think for many years now the regulatory framework governing banks didn't really specifically make provision for white-collar crime prosecutions?
Well, I think that basically the bankers have seen themselves as a protected species for 2 or 3 decades now, or probably longer. And the key incidents which spring to mind were the Blue Arrow trial of 1992, when 3 senior executives from County NatWest were given jail terms of between 1 year and 18 months for rigging a rights issue. And one broker from a firm called UBS Phillips and Drew was also to be jailed. But these convictions were quashed in rather suspicious, well, what seemed like rather odd circumstances, with a very precipitate Court of Appeal case. And so the guys were basically let off. And on the day that the Court of Appeal verdict was announced, something happened, which was that a senior person within the Serious Fraud Office phoned a friend of mine to tell my friend that from that moment on there would be no prosecutions of high-level bankers or city institutions. And that, I think, basically that might have been where the rot started, because if bankers believe they are basically immune from prosecution and whatever they do, however much they rig the markets, however much they steal from their customers or whatever, you set a quite a dangerous, environment where bankers believe they can do whatever they want.
Sure, but why is that the environment that they're allowed to work in? I mean, is it that getting a prosecution is just really difficult in that case that you suggested, for instance, because the burden of proof is very high, and these are complex cases probably that
It depends on the appetite. I mean, after the savings and loans crisis in the US, there were about 100 prosecutions and imprisonments, I believe, of senior bankers. In Nigeria, they have, I believe, imprisoned over 100 bankers since the banking crisis. I think they've imprisoned quite a few in Iceland. So if there is an appetite at a high level within the government and within the judiciary, it can be done. You do have to devote resources, because fraud trials are obviously very complex and they can be hard for juries to comprehend. But they can happen, as in those examples I've just cited.
So are we unusual then as a country in this way? Are prosecutions taking place everywhere else and we sort of stand out as not doing that kind of thing?
I think we're uniquely lax in our treatment of white-collar crime, and I think we're now reaping the consequences. We had by far the most expensive bailouts of banks of any country in the world. The total cost was 1.3 trillion. And so, yeah, we are probably one of the most lax regimes where prosecution of white-collar crime is concerned.
Do you think then this inquiry that David Cameron has called today, this parliamentary review, is that going to get to the bottom of things in your
Definitely not. I think that's just a question of getting the paintbrush out again. So far we've had several reviews. We've had the House of Commons Treasury Select Committee review. We have had the FSA report from Lord Turner. We've also had the Vickers report. But none of these have got to the bottom of the problem, which is that bankers, unfortunately, in my experience, because I've actually written about this quite a lot over the past 4 years, have become totally immoral. There are lots and lots of SMEs up and down the UK who, if they had the resources, could sue and could win against RBS, against other banks, including Barclays and including Lloyds. And there's some real horrors that are lurking inside these banks, which haven't properly come to the surface yet, because the banks have very powerful teams of lawyers, and they have huge legal resources, even though they've been bailed out, to suppress the truth. And it's a real problem. I mean, I think people like Hampton, who you just had on your intro there, are absolute hypocrites, because this guy is running a bank which is committing some serious offences, including some of which are likely to come to the surface in the next few weeks, which include expropriation of assets and asset stripping of perfectly legitimate companies up and down the UK. And yet you hear him sort of sanctimoniously preaching and telling us, that he's terribly sorry if there's been any inconvenience caused and that sort of thing. I don't think people are going to stand for that much longer. And I really don't think that this parliamentary committee, this parliamentary inquiry, which David Cameron announced this afternoon, is going to resolve the problem at all.
Okay. All right. Okay, we'll leave it there. And of course, Sir Philip Hampton isn't here to answer those charges that you suggested there, but nothing's proved. We'll leave it there. Ian Fraser, thanks very much for joining us. Thank you.
Let's just bring you some breaking news that we're getting about Syria.